To be told someone's story is to stand on sacred ground. Sacred ground because someone is sharing their life with us, which takes vulnerability and authenticity. It is sacred ground because all too often we do not pause long enough to hear another's story or to share our own. Sacred ground that connects one's brilliance of soul to another. When we allow ourselves to hear and tell stories that reveal who we are, what we believe, why we are where we are, we realize that we do not need to invalidate someone's story because it is not our own experience, nor do we need to dismiss our own story for not being something it is not. All we need to do is breathe in and breathe out as we actively listen to the truth coming from the person speaking, whether that be someone else or from ourselves. As simply as this may sound to do, it is one of the scariest practices we can take on. It is scary because we cannot control whether the person we are speaking to will listen to us and truly hear us. If we will be able to manage any tension that may arise should difference takes place. Or if we can sit with the fact that our story has escaped our lips and now someone else may tell our story without our permission or perhaps without accuracy. Yet, when we do this practice, it can be a radical act in a world that tells us that sharing our stories isn't worth it because it won't change anything. It is a radical act because it frees us to believe our story matters. It is a radical act because stories have changed the course of history. Today we read a story from over 2,000 years ago, and it's still changing lives today. It is a radical act because it takes the time to tell our story and hear other people's stories. When we do that, we can actually see how our stories are more than a soundbite, more than polarization, and more than stereotypes. It is radical because it is one of the most simple acts and one of the most difficult ones, all at the very same time. The telling and hearing of stories changed the lives of an unnamed woman and a little girl in the stories that were retold again today. While on the surface, it looks like one story began and then was interrupted before the other one could continue. But there's more to it than first glance offers. The stories show how it feels to take the risk when it feels like we have nothing else to lose in our lives. Jairus was a synagogue leader. He was one who did not need to follow the teachings of Jesus. And yet, it took his daughter almost dying for him coming to Jesus and pleading with him for healing. Along the way to Jairus' house, an unnamed woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, whose very well-being could be at risk by being in that crowd, reached out to touch Jesus' cloak in hopes to receive healing. This particular story in a story is a literary tool in the Gospel of Mark that has been coined the Markan sandwich, where one story begins, another comes in the middle, and the first story concludes. With these stories sandwiched together, we get to explore how they are more than linear and more intertwined. These seemingly unrelated stories have this child and woman connected at the origins of the beginning of life and transition. You see, when the daughter of Jairus was born, given life, given a name, hugged and touched and brought into family, the very opposite was happening to the unnamed woman, for it was the same year she began to bleed. Her life as she knew it had changed. She was no longer allowed in public spaces or at religious rituals. She had now been an outcast. We know this because Jairus identifies his daughter as being 12, and the text tells us that the woman has been bleeding for 12 years. Their lives were transformed 12 years prior to the day they met Jesus, and their lives again were transformed in their engagements and encounters with Christ. While Jairus' daughter had him to plead for her, and the unnamed woman only had the gumption of herself, they shared another thing in common: their vulnerability. In society, Jairus' daughter was among a lower class simply because of her age. And the unnamed woman was of a lower class because the Levitical law had said she was ritually unclean and unable to be in relationships the way she had been. As one had some petitioning for them, the little girl, the other did not. There was still social risk for both when Jesus was the one they sought to heal them. Jairus had social class and one who was known throughout town. Yet it took great risk for a leader of a synagogue to go to the one that the synagogue was creating a case against. The unnamed woman risked the Levitical law and very punishment to find the courage to approach Jesus. Had anyone found out before she was healed, she could have been harmed. So she did it without speaking in hopes some miracle would take place. The healing of these two strangers show how their stories reveal that even though through different means, they were both brought back into society that day. That healing looks different, one public, one private, but healing still took place. The unnamed woman reached out her hand to touch Jesus' cloak in a public space, thinking she wouldn't be detected because she was in a large crowd. The instant her hand reached his garment, she knew she had been healed. And in that moment, she thought, I did it. I am well. And she thought she was the only one who knew. But as story goes, she wasn't. Jesus knew. And when Jesus asked who had touched him, the disciples note how ridiculous his question appeared to be. Jesus knew one person in the crowd knew it wasn't ridiculous. So he paused, allowing them to come forward. And he paused long enough for that woman to have her story heard. She risked it and she spoke up. And Jesus listened. And he did something even more remarkable than that. He called her daughter, a term she likely had not even heard from her family for the last 12 years. She had been identified. She had been seen. She was made well. While leaving this woman, Jesus recalls that he is on the way to Jairus' daughter, and some of Jairus' servants come to tell him that she is dead. There's no need to come. Jesus says, continue. She's only asleep. When she gets to the house, or when they get to the house, only 3 disciples journey with Jesus, along with Jairus' parents. Everyone else is asked to leave a much more private space for healing. And as Jesus enters this space where the child is lying, he reaches out his hand this time to provide healing and says, Talitha cum, little girl, rise up. She is awakened and her parents are overcome with emotion. Jesus' healing of the unnamed woman brings her back to life and will allow her to participate in her life in a holistic way once again. The little girl rises because Jesus calls to her. And he does something very pragmatic. He reminds the parents to feed her, which is a sign of her full healing of body and livelihood. These 2 stories were deemed unworthy to be shared in social structures of their times. Jairus going to Jesus was not how synagogue leaders were to address healing. The unnamed woman was not to be in crowds, let alone share her story. You see, when we allow social or societal systems to dictate whose stories we hear or how we hear them, we miss out on how stories change how we see the person telling it and how their very stories can be intertwined with ours. If we are in positions of power or prestige like Jairus, we need to be reminded that the difficult, the painful, the unpretty parts of our stories are to be shared along with those societal positions have deemed worthy of sharing. Had Jairus kept within what was socially acceptable for him, his daughter never would have been told to rise up. Perhaps we are in social positions that are deemed lowly or less than, and believe the lies that have been told to us that we should not tell our stories, for they are not worthy of being heard, let alone being told. The unnamed woman proclaims that all stories are worthy of being heard, and it is courageous for us to share them. If we never question which social or systematic powers tell us what is appropriate to share or how we are to go about sharing it, we will always run the risk of silencing our voices, because how we might express ourselves may be stereotyped as being angry, emotional, crazy, pathetic, when all we hope to have happen is for our full stories to be heard. Jairus nor the unnamed woman acted appropriately that day, and thanks be to God that they didn't. These two stories are laced together to teach the people present at each of those healings about the irresistible power of faith and grace. That when social systems fail us, Jesus never will. Rather, Jesus will bring freedom and healing and hope. That when those who write great stories like those that we find in Scripture and they deem it unworthy to include our names, it is Jesus who will always call you by name and will always call you beloved child. When we do not believe people will stop to hear our stories, we are granted the ear of Christ who will listen. And we are reminded that it is worth the risk to prove our disbelief wrong by telling our story and give people a chance to listen. In telling our stories, we will find healing that will come in the forms of being heard, releasing the weight of having kept a story to ourselves, and the healing power of being seen for who we are. These two stories are more than Jesus healing two people physically. They're about how a discarded woman found the gumption to do something that brought her story healing, and how a man of power and prestige humbled himself in order to heal his child. Yes, the healing matters, and so do the stories that led up to the healing and that follow that healing. How often do we ignore the names of those who seek to tell us their stories? How easy is it for us as individuals, as people in a society to disbelieve, stifle, or even silence the stories of those who are young, sick, or women? What happens if we allow ourselves to keep folks unnamed, only to be known by their social status, race, gender, sexual orientation, economic means, ableness, disability, illness? It makes it easier for us to assume we know their story, cast them as a stereotype, or believe the soundbite we heard was all we need to know, so no need to take the time to hear the full story. We are taught more frequently than not to move quickly in life because there is so much going on and even more to attend to. Yet we learn from the Gospel of Mark that lives can be transformed when we risk to tell our story and when people pause and focus to hear our story. So let people be named on the streets, at our jobs, in hospitals, in synagogues. Let people be named because to strip them of their name is to allow them space to be othered. And when we place people as other, it becomes easy to allow the harm that comes to them to continue. Because when we allow other people to be othered, fear consumes, and their otherness is all we know. Let people speak their story. Do not hold someone's story in your mouth without permission. Speak your truth and trust that it will be heard by your family, by your friends, and by your community. Let people be more than their societal standings. Our stories are rich and dynamic. To keep them only to our social standings is to say they are one-dimensional and discredits the ways God has created each of us for the brilliance of life. So I invite you to stand on the sacred ground of Jairus' humbleness, the courage of the unnamed woman, the hope of the little child, and the listening and prophetic ear of Jesus. Do this in your day-to-day lives, for we also see that the sacred is initiated by the mundane act of telling and hearing stories. Live into the rich gospel tradition of telling your story and hearing those around you, because you will see that the lives of those being told are not just someone that you thought you knew, that the assumptions are not what they were, and allow yourselves to actually see them for who they are. So that when you might disagree with them, you actually have a foundation to see them as something more than a disagreement or a one-point argument. When the world feels too broken to heal, and that there's nothing we can do to impact it, we can practice the radical act of storytelling and listening to other people's stories as well. And when those telling their stories or hearing ours are different than we are able to humble ourselves and say, yes, this is your story, your truth, and it is not mine. But that does not mean yours is any less true than mine is. This helps us practice leaning into the presence of a God of yes and, a God that reminds us, yes, you are part of a great, powerful faith tradition, and you must carry on that tradition in the individual and collective life together. We must become storytellers of our lives and avid listeners of those stories shared with us. And as we do, we will heal lives. And in doing so, we shall begin to heal the many schisms in our world. As simple as storytelling may seem, we can see from Jairus and the unnamed woman, it is a risky practice. The gospel's ability to heal our lives depends on our willingness to take part in it. So take this truth for today. You are not unnamed. You are more than your social status. Your story is worth the risk to tell, and you are all called children of God. So go turn this world into sacred ground with your stories. The very well-being of our livelihood depends on it. Amen.